Hi, good Sunday. Welcome to this week's webinar, the final webinar of the May series. Today's topic is the topic of this week's presentation, thoughts and data input. Okay, so I'm trying to break some of my bad habits from the previous webinars, and you know what, I kind of ended up talking too much about what I'd already talked about. So I'm trying to break that habit. I got some great questions via email and various means. I'm going to try to get to those. Well, I will not try. I will get to those. We'll try to. We will dive into those right away. So thoughts and data input. Data input was one of my key positive difference-making fundamentals. You know, how I turned around. You know, I have a real horrific backstory of mental health difficulties that are really at the high end of the scale. And, you know, the reason I got into studying neuroscience and all this stuff was so I could understand what's going on in this thing. Why is it creating all this wild stuff? And then, you know, understanding it was only part of the picture. The big part was the things we need to do to change our mental states. And, you know, what I think we can really defeat almost anything. You know, wherever you are, whatever you're suffering from, we can defeat that. We can't really make it go away, but we can lessen its hold on it, maybe make it go away, or largely defeat it and tame it, like my polar bears. You know, this is all about taming our inner polar bears, those inner demons and all those things going on. Okay, so changing data input, changing the information we consume on a daily basis was a huge part of how I turned around my mental states, how my brain worked, how, you know, everything that created all these difficulties I went through. Okay, so that's you know, why we're looking at this data input. Now, in the previous week when we started looking at cognitive behavior therapy, mindfulness, meditation, CBT, we learned that thoughts are one of the key things we have to work on. I sort of outlined quite explicitly that those thoughts don't have to be there. They're just thoughts. They're not concrete, you know, they're not solid, unchangeable things. We can change them or make them go away. We started looking at that a little bit in cognitive behavior therapy. Now, I'm sure none of you, or I'm sure all of you, have some experience with trying to make your thoughts go away. It's difficult. You know, I say it's doable, but that doesn't mean it's not difficult. And one of the reasons and why we tie thoughts and data input together, and I touched on this in the broadcast, was, you know, what we consume, what we're absorbing, what we're allowing ourselves to absorb or seeking to absorb has a huge influence on what our thoughts are. Now, the questions, now the first question that came in, somebody, you know, kind enough to take the time to watch my presentation and form some questions. He wanted to know more about how this so-called data forms our thoughts. Okay, now this is a great question, and this is, you know, I get into this in some detail here and there in the blog. You know, like I said, this is just an introduction. The presentation on the presentation this week was just an introduction to how this works. But I am going to take this opportunity, because this is the kind of question I love. I'm going to take this opportunity to get into and explain more and make you understand better and deeper how what we consume influences our thoughts. And like I said, controlling our thoughts is hard, and but if we don't know what's creating them, that makes it even harder. It's okay to have these thoughts and go, okay, I have to change my thoughts, and we do all this work to make them go away or change our thoughts. We all hear about this, in various kinds of therapy or things we read online, and it's freaking difficult. And one of the reasons it's difficult is we don't know what's creating the thoughts. It's easy for psychologists and therapists and all these, shiny, happy people online to say, oh, just change your thoughts. But it's not easy, especially when you're one of us. We have these long entrenched mental health struggles. So that's why I do what I do. That's why I study neuroscience, because people tell us to do these things, but nobody knows why they're hard or what's really going on. So that's so I'm going to get into a little more detail on this whole business of data input and thoughts. Now, in the broadcast, I talked about the old Freudian idea of conscious and subconscious. What we, consciousness is kind of what we're experiencing. That's our thoughts, our ideas, our mental states. That's what's going on in kind of our waking mind that we're aware of. And, and it's been understood for since at least Freudian time, but even before that, we don't seem to be aware of everything that's going on in here. So Freud, he was the first one to kind of start to figure it out and break it down and create some models for understanding. And that's mostly how sorry, I got to bring this a little closer. That's mostly how people kind of where their understanding of it comes from. But as I said in the broadcast, neuroscience, the study of how this thing works and how it does and why it does what it does, it has come quite a while, in the little more than a century since Freud had all his ideas. His observations were correct. There's kind of what we experience going on, and then there's all kinds of stuff below the surface. And as I said, this is, well, it's not just my view. I just really strongly feel it's better we understand this. We have this modern science, like neuroscience is one of the most cutting edge, amazing fields of science there is today, coming up with all these discoveries and learning how this thing works. And that's been going on for what we know today is mostly in the last 5 or 6 decades, and the vast majority of that has been within the last 5 or 10 years. So it's kind of dumb, I think, if we don't make use of all this new scientific discovery. And that's why I get so jazzed about doing all this, because it really is fun and exciting. And the fun and exciting part is passing it on to you poor people, so you have a better idea of what's going on and creating all this misery and stuff going on. So let's have a look at the reader's question. How exactly does all this data affect our thoughts? So, we looked at consciousness a wee bit. I talked about that a little bit. We'll come back to that now. So conscious is up here in the Freudian model. you know, I'm sure everybody's seen this iceberg, this visual iceberg metaphor. You know, there's this little bit above the surface, and that's kind of what everybody sees. And then there's all this stuff below the surface that we don't see, we're not aware of. And like I say, I view all this through the lens of neuroscience, and I'll get to this in a second. So there's this consciousness, you know, that we're aware of. And then there's all this stuff we're not aware of going on in our heads. I got to be careful here because I'm liable to screw up the spelling. I'm not a great speller, people. I'm liable to mess up the spelling. You know, we all get used to spell check on our computers, and we forget how to write things out. So there we are. I think we did it right. So subconsciousness, I view it as all these anatomical, neurobiological, blah, blah stuff that nobody knows is there. You know, and I'll you know, so, you know, we've been slowly getting to learn these. If you know, if this broadcast is the first time you've come across me in Taming the Polar Bears, don't worry if this is not familiar to you. You know, I have all these posts in the blog and some of the previous broadcasts where I'm talking about this stuff, and you know, it took me years of study to get this. So, you know, nobody expects you to get it right away and memorize all these things. You just kind of have to absorb the concepts. And let those, your brain will figure it out. Just absorb the concepts and don't worry about memorizing things or if you've seen this before or not. You're all in the same boat. This is all new, and that's okay. So you know, in the neuroscience of music therapy and in the broadcast, I talked about some of these different brain regions going on, or occipital lobe. You know, back here is where sight is created. The cerebellum and prefrontal cortex and amygdala, all these little brain regions nobody's heard about before. And you've certainly, unless you've been following my blog, you've certainly never thought about before. So anyway, that's what I consider part of the subconscious. These things we're not aware of, all this stuff. You know, hang on, I forgot something here. You know, so this consciousness, this stuff above the surface is, you know, what we think of as mind. You know, it's what we kind of think of as, you know, like what I like to say, quote unquote, you. So there you are. And, you know, this is not exactly where you are. It's just where you experience you is all down here, the stuff we're about to look at. So that's what I think of as subconscious. We learned some about the stress response system. You know, these wild and wacky brain regions down here, the hippocampus, that's very involved. Sorry, I should make this closer here. The hippocampus, you know, very important for creating memories. The amygdala, hippocampus and amygdala work closely together, emotions, things like that. Hypothalamus, you know, all these things are processing and creating information in our brains, and this is all operating way below your conscious awareness. You know, we looked at, you know, some of the certain parts of the stress response system. Here's our amygdala again, and this processes information. I'll get back to this in a minute. You know, so this is, you know, what I consider, you know, the subconscious, what's going on below our conscious awareness. What else we have? You know, we've looked at this before, our wiring harness. You know, who we are, what we are, how we, you know, what we can do or not do. This is really important. This connects all the parts of the brain together. This is the wiring we hear about in popular articles about brains and us and you know, we're wired this way or wired that way. And, you know, there's, you know, truth to a lot of that, but not exactly how they're portraying it in popular media. In any case, this is our wiring harness, as I like to say, and it connects, well, I'll get to what it connects in a moment. You have enough wiring in your brain, yes, you have enough wiring in your brain to wrap around the world twice. That's a lot of wiring. Anyway, that's all part of your subconscious, all the stuff you're not aware of that's creating you and this mind and conscious experience. Now, the real big part of what's going on, and this, I've touched on this in Neuroscience 101 and here and there in different blog posts, but this is a neuron. Neurons, as I've said quite a few times, are like tiny little storage devices. They're like tiny little flash drives. And, you know, this isn't, you know, this is only going to work depending on what you put into it. You know, you plug this into your computer, it's not going to do anything unless you put stuff in there. And, you know, whatever's in there is going to come out. Whatever's in there is going to come up on your computer screen to work on. A lot of blog posts I've talked about consciousness is kind of like the computer screen where we're working. You know, that's what we're consciously aware of and what we're working on at any one time in this vast amount of capability that your computer has. And your computer is not going to do anything unless it's got information that's on different kinds of little storage devices, and a flash drive is just an example. And so it is with all the little neurons in your brain. They're all like little storage devices. Well, not all of them, but many of them are like storage devices. There's different kinds of neurons with different jobs, but a lot of them, their job is to store stuff. Now, I think you see where we're getting at here. So just like this little flash drive, you know, your brain can only do stuff, can create stuff, can create what's going on in here, create our thoughts, people, excuse me, create our thoughts, you know, depending on what's stored in here. And what's stored in here, people, is, well, not exactly, but quite a bit like this little flash drive. It depends on what we put in there. And what we put in there, people, is information and data. And that just doesn't come out of, you know, the sky or out of our knee bone or something. It comes in from what we're absorbing through our eyes, our ears, and so on. Mostly our eyes and ears, but through our nose and mouth, tactile sensations. And that is the various media. So we remember this is our subconscious, and our subconscious is all this brain stuff I'm introducing. So that is from all this media we're absorbing from all kinds of different sources today. You know, our friends, let's just put social. And by this social, I mean our real life and blood, day-to-day friends and family and so on. You know, we have social media, which is just a variation on this. Widely influential social media. And oh, I better put music. Let's put music there. We're absorbing that too. So all these things, you know, they're basically sights and sounds that are packets of information that our brain is absorbing and getting stored in all these neurons of ours, okay? So, and, you know, so all of this stuff we're absorbing through sight, sound, and media and all these things, you know, they come in through our five senses and even our stomach, but that's a little bit of a topic for a different day. And, you know, like I've been saying, you know, these fundamental components of the stress response system, their job is to monitor everything we're bringing in through sight, sound, taste, smell, tactile sensations. That's their job, is to monitor all this information and make sense of it. And is it important, not important, what to do, things like that. And then, you know, so there's this process of doing this, and, you know, and it goes through the hippocampus and the amygdala, and these two play the primary role for what gets stored, people, in all our neurons. And not only that, if it's super scary, or, you know, and super scary is just a perception. You know, nothing's inherently scary or not scary. You know, that depends on what our amygdala does. You know, ooh, this is scary. So it attaches a scary tag to it. So filing lady puts it up in all these filing cabinets, which are made up of billions of neurons. And just like our little flash drive people, you know, what creates our collective thoughts and what's going on up here is the collective sort of mass of what our poor brain is trying to make out of all this information we're gathering every day. So, you know, so there you are up there, and all this stuff is coming in. You know, only part of it you're aware of. Vast majority of that is getting processed subconsciously by all these brain regions I'm talking about. And all that is going to bubble up and burble up and create what your like what I like to call your conscious experience, your moods, your mental states, your thoughts. As we looked at in CBT, those are going to create your emotions and behaviors and kind of everything about what we think of it as us. That all comes from down here. So Freud was kind of right about that. He just didn't know about all this stuff. Well, he did a little bit. There was a little bit known, but not like we have today. Okay, so now, so you know, just back to the question, and just to put some little, you know, I really want to drive this point home more here today. Let's come back to our neuron here. Let me get my board here. If we come back to our neuron, you know, again, these are little storage devices, and they are, you know, I talk a lot about neuroplasticity, how all of this can change. And, you know, with each bit of information we bring in, with each thought we're having, this activity within, you know, many of these neurons becomes very, very dynamic, very, very active. You know, I have my favorite neuroscientist, David Eagleman, is among them. He compares the activity in a single neuron to that of a major city. So if you can think of a city near you and imagine all the activity that goes on in that city day to day, a single solitary neuron is on par with that activity. Just like the city, what goes on in that city depends a great deal on what comes into it, all the little tiny details that float into that city and create the collective, whatever experience of that city. So that's all going on in a single neuron. And that creates kind of how the information is kind of cataloged and stored. Okay, so that's a single neuron, the activity of a city. And you have people, all of you, even if you don't think you're very smart sometimes, you all have, let me clean this up a little bit. 86, and I think this is 3 zeros, or sorry, 9 zeros. 86 billion neurons. 86 billion little flash drives, and the neuron holds more information than these flash drives. Well, that's not, well, it is and it isn't true. It's not quite as strict as an analogy as that, but we can think of it as that. So, we have 86 billion neurons. They all have kind of different jobs to do. Many of them are involved in storing information like we're looking at. This stored information is this data we're absorbing, and how we're absorbing it becomes what we think of as memory. I've spoken and written about memory before in a post on how depression, bipolar disorder, and so on, how memory impacts that. So this is kind of what I'm talking about there. But most of what we think of the storage neurons, the information neurons, are up here in our neocortex. And we have 86 billion of those, a good number up there in our neocortex, storing information that's going to create us and our thoughts and our ideas and, all these things that we think of as us. Now, as I've said again and again in the post, in the blog, the information in here is useless if it can't be passed on to other neurons and form bigger pictures and thoughts and things. So that takes place through axons, which is part of the wiring we've been looking at. How the information is passed on is through all these little tiny, very, very tiny little spiky tree branch things. Those are called dendrites. And those are not fixed. Those are changing all the time. I likened them in one of my posts to like the old switchboards, the old telephone switchboards. They're like, the operator would have a little thing at the end of a wire called a jack. When she plugged that into the switchboard, that connected two circuits to exchange information. And, where the point where these dendrites meet are kind of like that switchboard. We connect them and we have information flowing. And all these dendrites, they're changing all the time in real time, depending on all this information we're absorbing. And, as you're sitting here listening to me, and kind of gathering what I'm saying with some interest, these things are changing in real time, making new connections. What's going on in the neuron is changing in real time, rejigging the information in there. And all of these, to put, if you think this is a big number, each neuron will have up to 10,000 of these connections. All that adds up to close to 150 trillion connections. If we think of these little jacks at the ends of wires that make connections, we have around 150 trillion of those. Those are changing all the time depending on what we're inputting into our heads. And all this is kind of creating, just for today's purposes, back to thoughts. That's where our thoughts come from. So I'm going to work on that a little bit more in a moment, why this is all important to understand. I know it might seem dreadfully dull, but when we want to, as I've been establishing, if we want to change our mental states, our behaviors, and what's going on in our lives, we have to change our thoughts. We've kind of established that. That's quite well known and has been well known for thousands of years. You can find, I've got some favorite old Chinese philosophers that I like to quote on this. Change your thoughts, change your mind, change your life. That's absolutely true. But as we've kind of also understand, much more difficult than, it's easy to say in concept, but difficult to do. And now I have another question. We may as well flow right into this next question because it's very related to what I've just outlined. Another follower wanted to know specifically, how does all this information affect our mental states? So, we're beginning to understand, or I hope you're beginning to understand, how important your thoughts are. What's the nature of your thoughts? What's the emotional quotient of your thoughts? All these things are going to affect our mental states. And, and as I've said, what our thoughts are kind of the collective work of all these neurons and brain regions that the neurons belong to. This is what creates our thoughts. So, what we input is what we're kind of storing throughout our brain and all these neurons and specific brain regions. Now, how does that relate to our mental states, good or bad? Let's return to, here we are. Let's return to our stress response system. Now, if you're new to this, if you haven't seen this, or been following me for a while, that's okay. I talk about this in other broadcasts and in the blog. But when I wanted to understand, poor mental health, why do we break down? Why do we melt down? Why do these things happen to us? This is why. And I just found that nobody in psychiatry or even psychology, well, nobody I talked to or read and I searched everywhere, nobody really had what I felt were adequate answers. So that's why I got so into studying neuroscience. I wanted to understand how this worked and why it's doing what it's doing to you or me or millions of people every day. And tens of thousands of people die every day because this isn't getting understood and dealt with properly. That's what got me really jazzed about doing all this. And, all the roads I studied, and I studied every road I could find, led to the stress response system. So many of the symptoms I talked about when talking about depression and a lot of these things going on in us came down to the stress response system. And, you know, when we're talking about information, this stuff we're absorbing on a day-to-day basis, you know, I've been talking about this quite a bit in different ways, in different broadcasts and different posts. You know, our brain is bringing in information 24/7 through our eyesight, you know, visual information, auditory information, all this information. This is this data I'm talking about in whatever form it is, all goes through the stress response system, all goes through, you know, these little components. Up here it says stressor. I just consider this information, this data we're talking about. It all goes through these components, and these components decide whether this is a threat, not a threat, help decide whether this is a benefit, not a benefit, things like that, whether to respond or not. You know, the responses come down to, you know, the kind of the simple things a lot of us sort of understand about the stress response system: fight, flee, or freeze. You know, I've talked about quite a bit. You know, what your brain is always looking for is something to do about all this information we're gathering. And as I've also kind of established, you know, our brains are not really well adapted to the modern world. You know, our brains spent millions of years, you know, prior to modern human history, and modern human history goes back a couple of million years, and especially the last several 100,000 years. And the vast majority of that time was evolving for and adapting to conditions, environmental conditions and situations that bear absolutely no resemblance to the modern world. Okay, I've kind of emphasized that quite a bit. So back to mental health. You know, and my position that you know, most, you know, all the symptoms we looked at, the majority of the symptoms we looked at when in the discussion on depression, and I could go through any psychiatric disorder and take all the symptoms, and, you know, like I like to say, this is ground zero for all of it. This is Grand Central Station for all this, where all this information gets processed and what the brain has to do with it. And this system is overwhelmed by today, all this information we're absorbing. So a lot of what we're experiencing when we're breaking down, when we're melting down, when we're overcome with emotion and overwhelm, is there is just too much stuff coming in for our brains to deal with. And this does not mean you are inadequate or stupid or anything like that. It simply means our brains were not designed and have not evolved and adapted for absorbing so much information. And not only that, people, those of us that struggle more with mental health problems do so because some of these key stress response components, the amygdala and hippocampus and some of these in us happen to be formed in such ways that they attach way more emotional oomph and importance and significance to all this information. So not only are we absorbing more information than we're designed to handle, we are creating higher levels of importance and impact to that information than we're designed to handle. So all of this creates the overwhelm we're experiencing. And coming back to what our brains are designed to do, with this information that we're absorbing, and like I say, it's somewhat more complex than this, obviously, but it comes down to fight, take on this thing that's going on and try to make it go away. So fight, flight, escape from it. There's nothing wrong with escaping. If you're getting attacked by a hippo or something, the most reasonable thing to do is run away from it, not try to fight it. Or freeze, do nothing. Sometimes that's not a bad option, but we have, our brain is designed to make us do something. Now, I've also talked about control, whether we can control a situation, do something about it, has an enormous effect, an enormous influence on whether we feel stress. And stress is the release of all these little hormones and neurotransmitters and all kinds of neurobiological stuff that kicks off this chain reaction of all these things we experience when we're, stressed out about something. The racing heart, the racing thoughts, the highly emotional thoughts, that's all kicked off by the neurobiology of the stress response system. And whether that happens or not, one of the main factors will be how much control we have over that. And as I established, when was it, last week, I think, in CBT, talking about CBT, if we have a sense of control over the situation, what's going on, stress levels go down, all these stress hormones and all this stuff, we're kind of okay. And if we have no control, same situation, but no control, everything goes through the roof. So this is all leading back to why this affects our mental health so much. All this information, this stuff we're absorbing from around the world and all these things, 99.9% of it is literally beyond our control. This is a shitty thing to admit, to say I can't do anything about this, but that is an elementary truth. You cannot do anything about most of the stuff going on in the world, even going on in your own city or neighborhood. That sucks, I know, and we're working to improve that and changing that. But right now, that is the truth. So when we're absorbing all this information and it's all getting routed through our stress response system, we are putting mountains and mountains and mountains of stuff in our brain that we have no control over. And that, people, is the absolute guaranteed recipe for emotional meltdown and overwhelm. And this is why, people, that so many end up dying of suicide, getting into intractable drinking problems, drug problems. It is because of this overwhelm that's going on, and that overwhelm creates pain. That pain further stimulates the stress response system, and it's just a hideous loop. So we have to stop that loop. Okay, we have to stop this cycle. And so I hope, we're not going to completely 100% understand all this today, but I hope that gives you a better idea of where your thoughts are. And like, again, all this we're absorbing is creating our thoughts. So, people, even if we escape from the media, we turn that off for a while, the thoughts, all this information have created, they're still there. We can take a break from all this, but the thoughts are still going on. We can't forget it. Okay? And this comes down to how all our brains and all these billions of neurons have been programmed. And that's why this is so freaking difficult. You know, this is like the old proverbial pushing boulders uphill. You know, if we keep flooding our brain with all this stuff we can't do anything about or control, all this negative, shitty stuff going on in the world that's so emotionally impact, you know, every day we're getting up and pushing boulders uphill, and every day those boulders will roll right back over top of us. And that's why we end up feeling crushed and broken, and why so many people feel like taking their lives. Okay? So now that I've got your attention, I think you can understand now this is important. So, so we have to change our data. This is what this comes down to. This is why this is such a key tenet in my difference-making fundamentals. This is a basic fundamental change we have to do, we have to make to change, this, what we experience up here, our conscious experience, our mind and us. If we don't change what's coming in, all this data, the brain's not going to change. The brain is just going to keep producing what's driving us crazy. So, we can think of all this information as a tap, and we have to turn that spigot and turn off the tap. But as you've discovered, and as I just outlined, the thoughts that all of this has created aren't going to go away right away. And that, people, is where we come into what to do. Now somebody, I can't see my thing here. I have to look around here. Sound is great now, thank you. Somebody wrote in before in my aborted broadcast. I did this once already this morning. I'm yakking away and I realized I don't have my microphone hooked up. So that was kind of embarrassing. What to do? Like I say, the stress response is, all this stuff is just, what do we do? What do we do about all this? So we can't learn about all this stuff without something to do. So, I've got your attention. I think you understand better now. So the $64,000 question is always, and then let me put this in a more cheerful color. What to do? So somebody asked before, what do you consider good information? And that's a great question. We can, there's zillions and zillions of bits of information going around the world every day. And so we can put all kinds of different stuff in our brain and start reprogramming all our little neurons and connections and all this stuff. So here we go. Okay, so what to do? Okay, so we're going to create a challenge. I'm going to call this, just for now, I'm going to call this the 1 week challenge. So today is Sunday. We're going to try this for a whole week. You can keep going. You don't have to stop. But we're going to try to do this for at least a week at minimum. 1 week challenge. So now we do two things. We want to stop what we've been absorbing or minimize it. So, it's not always possible to completely stop it, of course, but we're going to do as much as we can to minimize it. So let me redo this here a little bit. So what to do? So we're going to create a 1 week challenge. The 1 week changing data input challenge. Now in the broadcast on music therapy, I talked quite a bit about, how I really want you to think of this, all these things we're learning, these different things we're learning, these different fundamentals. I want you to think of, this as kind of a therapeutic program, and I introduced this in in music therapy, and I want us to kind of think of it like concussion protocol. So I'm going to come back to our concussion protocol idea. Like I said, with a concussion, there's a lot of little microscopic damage. When I talk about neurons and stuff, and all the little, there's some ridiculously detailed, finely detailed things that make all this happen, and this is damaged a lot in concussion. And what I learned, I studied what goes on in concussion quite a bit, and then of course what goes on, all the neurobiological basis for our symptoms in so-called mental health problems. I found a remarkable amount of similarities. So, again, I want you to think of this as kind of like concussion protocol. You have a serious concussion. Sorry, there's a little fly buzzing me here. You have a concussion, or even a not so serious. We understand more and more that even mild concussions can have long-lasting impacts on life and mental states. So, we're going to think of this concussion protocol. So concussion protocol means we have to do these things and not do a lot of other things. So that's our framework for going forward with all these challenges and different therapies we're using. So the 1 week challenge, let me get a different color, put this in red. No media, no news media, no news. Okay, no news media. You're not going to die if you don't watch the media. The world's not going to fall apart. It's, the only thing that's going to happen is your mind is going to get better. Okay, so let's not get our bums in a knot about turning off the news. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or ignoring the world and all this stuff. It just means you're doing the very sensible thing of taking care of you. Yes, you are important and worth taking care of. That's the subject for a different broadcast, but that's where we're going to go today. So no media. So that's pretty straightforward. My notes are getting all mixed up here. Now, as we've kind of discovered, we can cut off our flow of information, but that's not enough, because we're left with our thoughts. So what we have to do is replace it with other stuff. Now, personally, I think all my broadcasts and blog posts are kind of awesome, because they're all kind of talking positively about changing your brain and your life and all these things. So that's an option. You can replace it with my stuff. But seriously, now let's go back to music therapy. As I've talked about again and again, when there were times I really couldn't do anything, I listened to a lot of music. So one of the things we're going to replace, all this stuff we're absorbing is with music. And, I'd like you, this ties music therapy and this data input and data change thing together. And, if we come back to what we were just looking at with that pyramid thing and the part of the top, what's going on in our brains, We're not going to change what's going on in our brains if we keep putting the same stuff in down below all these subconscious brain regions. So when I say listen to music, I would rather that not be, old favorite standbys. I really want you to start exploring new music. There is, almost literally limitless amounts of music out there. It's crazy. So have some fun. Go to YouTube or internet radio. There's all kinds of different things to do. And find some different kinds of music. You might spend, a morning or part of a day playing around looking for, there's so many different kinds, like Spanish guitar, Latin music, jazz is one of my favorites, classical music. You could spend 3 lifetimes getting to know all the classical music that's available. But anyway, it's going to be new. It's going to be a little bit unfamiliar. Because it's unfamiliar, you're going to go, oh God, I don't know if I like this, and things like that. We're going to push past that a little bit. You're going to find something you're okay with as long as it's new, and you're just going to put it on in the background. You can sit down and specifically listen to it. That's okay too, but mostly you're just going to have it on in the background as you put away doing other little important things in your little world, your life, not this big freaking world that we can't control out there. I've talked about this, regarding mindfulness and things. We're just going to focus on simple little things in our home and in our lives. So we're going to, the Chinese had a wonderful, or the Taiwanese anyways, had a wonderful term for it. They called it ear washing. Listening to music. There was a cute little Chinese term for it, and it translated into ear washing, and I still love that. So we can think of it as washing our ears, washing our mind of all this negative stuff. So we'll put on some music, and we're just going to kind of have it on in the background. We don't have to super duper pay attention to it, but I want it to be something somewhat new. And this is why sometimes if you find the right internet radio station, you can just put that on, and they'll just play what they play, and you don't have to think about it too much. This is subconsciously, this kind of works better. Just kind of let your mind absorb it while you're kind of putting around doing other things. Okay, so music, reading is a ridiculously awesome thing to do. Turn off the freaking television and all the stuff we look at online and pick up an actual book. Enormous amounts of research and I've kind of understood this all my life because I've always been a passionate reader. But anyway, so reading can have an enormous positive cognitive effects, enormous positive effects on how our brain works. Now, again, we want to be careful about what we're reading. Let's try to read something a little bit different than what we're used to, something a little different from the world we've kind of created for ourselves. Something a little bit new is really important in all of this. If we want to reprogram all our neurons and all these wiring and brain regions and stuff, that's not going to happen if we don't put new stuff in there. So try to find some, fiction. Reading breaks down into fiction and nonfiction. I'd like you to start thinking of a little bit of both. Some fiction. And if you're in the difficult mental states I can imagine many of you being in, you kind of want to stick to light fiction, but try, there's pulp fiction, there's a lot of garbage out there, and I kind of want to steer you away from that. So see what you can find for some, quote unquote, higher types of fiction. Nonfiction, I've got kind of a whole different thing about this, and again, this is just the beginning, but different, and I've got a whole thing about growth mindset. I've got some exciting guests coming. I'm going to start having guests soon, and we're going to talk about growth mindset. That all ties into what we read. It'd be very cool if you could pick a subject, some kind of subject, and start reading up on that. And just learning more, I don't know, about flowers or plants or something, without emotional attachments to it. We kind of want to get away from that. So different reading material, and I'm aware that I'm running over time here again. Oh, I've lost my notes. Here they are. Oh, and just plain old nature. When I went on my Beanmobile adventures a few years ago, one of the things that made that less scary and more doable, my Beanmobile adventures, I lived in a broken down, unheated van with Mrs. Bean. Mrs. Bean and I lived in this old van through the winter. And one of the things that made that more doable for me was that I knew I'd be spending a lot of time in nature. Now, this is not entirely possible for many people. So, this is perfectly okay to do this online or on TV. So depending, what TV programming you have available, try to spend more time watching nature programs. And when I talk about what our brains are designed and not designed to do, when you are absorbing nature, whether in real world or even watching programs on TV or on your computer, nature, trees and animals and all these things, that's the environment your brain spent, the evolutionary past of our brains. That's what it evolved for, being in those environments. So do what you can do to absorb more nature, whether that's through online programming, television programming, getting out to walk in a park. And I know many of you live in busy places and you want to escape people and stuff. That's not very realistic. So, this is where we start learning to block things out and put our focus where we want it to be. So, you can go to a pretty busy place and find somewhere where you can maybe sit and just sort of look at the, even a small, like if I look around my room here, this small little room, you can find a little space like that has some trees and tall grass and who knows, some butterflies and stuff. And just be there. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to stay there for very long. It's just little bits that we can. And again, we can do this online and on television. And also, speaking of YouTube, you can find lots of therapeutic, music-y kind of stuff that's made up largely of nature sounds. I found some great ones. It's just got falling rain and flutes and things, and extremely calming. Other ones, with just the sound of the sea, things like that. And it just, your brain kind of doesn't know the difference. Doesn't matter if you're not physically there. Your brain will still process those sounds as if you're there. So you kind of have to block out this whole thing. Oh, I can't be there in real life. It sucks. It doesn't work. Just forget that stuff and just let your earwash, as the Chinese said, these natural nature sounds. And just your brain will start absorbing that more and start replacing all this crap we can't deal with, okay? So I'm going to tie this off. Thanks for joining me. This was take 2. I screwed up the first take earlier this morning. And, I'm going to take a break from doing these webinars. I've been doing them for 6 or 7 weeks now, and I kind of had a busy May schedule for them, and I'm kind of tired, and you're probably sick of them right now. So I'm going to take a break. I'm going to give you guys a break, and I'm going to, some of the ones I recorded before, I'm going to work on those and rejig how I do those and re-record them. Like I said, a lot of this I'm going to organize and break down into smaller little mini courses, so it's in smaller, more easily digestible bits, and that are part of a little mini course or program. Okay. Now, if you're coming across this new, I am Brad Esau of Taming the Polar Bears. You can find my blog at tamingthepolarbears.blogspot.ca. If you have questions or want to know more, write to tamingthepolarbears@gmail.com. Thank you, and bye for now.